Before the last fire was put out, before the final gate fell, before the last soldier lowered his sword, there was always a moment of complete silence. It was the silence that came after screaming. The smoke was still thick enough to taste, the smell of burning wood mixed with something heavier, something iron-edged that no soldier ever bothered to name. In the center of a newly conquered city, if you had stood there in those first hours, you would have seen a column forming. Not a column of soldiers, a column of women. Some were still holding the hands of children. Some had come from temples. Some had been dragged from doorways still open. One woman in that column held a bronze clasp to her chest, a small household fastening, the kind you press to a cloak at the shoulder. She had grabbed it on instinct. It was the last object from her home she would ever touch. In a few minutes, you will understand why that clasp meant everything, and why Rome made sure it meant nothing at all. Now, let's go back to the beginning. If you're drawn to history that official accounts were designed to bury, consider subscribing. This channel exists to uncover what was never meant to be found. Rome did not think of itself as a civilization built on conquest. It thought of itself as a civilization built on order. That distinction was not rhetorical. It was operational. The Romans had legal frameworks, administrative processes, and institutional categories for nearly every human situation. When an army marched into a foreign city and the fighting stopped, what happened next was not chaos. It was procedure. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to look at clearly. To understand what happened to women after a Roman military victory, you first have to understand what Rome understood victory to mean. A triumph was not simply a military outcome. It was a legal event. The moment a city was classified as captured, capta, a formal transformation occurred. The people inside it ceased to be foreign citizens or subjects of a rival power. They became, in the language of Roman law, things that had been acquired. The Latin word used in military and legal contexts was praeda, plunder. And plunder, by definition, has no rights. This was not a fringe interpretation. This was the institutional consensus of the Roman world, articulated by jurists, repeated in military manuals, embedded in the calculations of Senate-approved campaigns. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE and working close to Roman military leadership, described the standard practice after city capture in precise, almost administrative language. Everything within the walls, living and otherwise, fell to the soldiers under the authority of the commanding general. Historians have debated the exact scope of what Polybius meant. What they do not debate is that women were explicitly included in the category of praeda. The records make that clear. But to understand what that classification actually destroyed, you have to go back further, to the world that existed before Rome arrived at the gates. The world before the gates broke was not a world without its own order. This is easy to forget, because the surviving histories are almost entirely Roman. But archaeology and fragmentary accounts allow glimpses. In Carthage, in Corinth, in Capua, in Epirus, the cities Rome absorbed or destroyed over 4 centuries of expansion, women held specific social roles tied to their households, their temples, their family networks. A woman's position was defined by her relationships: daughter, wife, priestess, merchant's partner. These were not egalitarian societies, but they were legible societies. A woman knew, more or less, the perimeter of her world and the rules that governed it. Then the perimeter was removed. The removal was rarely instantaneous. It happened in stages. And the stages are worth examining because they reveal how a system absorbs human beings and reprocesses them as commodities, not through disorder, but through the application of increasingly formalized procedures. Each stage was designed to feel, to those inside it, like something other than what it was. The siege felt like military necessity. The sorting felt like administration. The sale felt like commerce. By the time a woman understood the full shape of what was happening to her, she was already deep inside a process that had no exit she could reach on her own. The first stage was the siege itself. Roman siege warfare was systematic and often prolonged. Cities under siege experienced starvation, disease, and the progressive exhaustion of every resource. By the time a city fell, many of its inhabitants had already been reduced in physical capacity to the point where organized resistance to what followed was nearly impossible. This was not an accident. Roman military doctrine understood that a weakened population was a more manageable population. The siege was, in part, a tool of psychological preparation. For the soldiers, yes, but also, functionally, for the conquered. The fall of the city typically began at night or at dawn, in the hours when disorientation was highest. Roman soldiers entered in coordinated groups. The killing of armed men was the first priority. After that, the procedures shifted. Women and children were separated from adult men who survived. This separation had a practical logic that Roman commanders articulated openly. It reduced the possibility of coordinated resistance and made the sorting process faster. The word sorting is not an anachronism. Roman practice after city capture involved genuine categorization. Some individuals had ransom potential. Some had skill value. Some had no calculable value to the Roman command at all. The categorization determined what came next. Here is where the archive grows both richer and more deliberately obscured. The richness comes from Roman legal texts, which were meticulous about property and transaction. The obscurity comes from the fact that those same texts treated human beings as a subcategory of property, meaning their experiences were recorded only insofar as they affected Roman legal calculations. The Digest of Justinian, compiled in the 6th century CE, but drawing on centuries of Roman jurisprudence, contains extended discussions of the legal status of persons captured in war. The term used is capti or captivi. The texts are explicit. Capture in a just war, bellum justum, a category Rome applied to nearly all of its own wars, resulted in the immediate legal transformation of the captured person into a slave. This was not a temporary condition pending negotiation. It was a permanent reclassification, unless reversed by formal legal procedure. The captured woman ceased, from the moment of capta, to be a legal person in any meaningful sense. She became an object of Roman property law. What this meant in practice varied. Some women were retained by soldiers in the immediate aftermath of capture. Roman military law technically required that all Praeda be surrendered to the common stock for later distribution. This was the manubii system, which gave commanding generals control over the distribution of war spoils. In practice, the records suggest significant variation. Military correspondence and later historical accounts indicate that commanding officers exercised enormous discretionary power in the hours after city capture, and that formal collection of all human praeda into organized holding was more aspiration than reality in many campaigns. What happened to women in those unrecorded hours is, as subsequent scholars have noted, incompletely documented by design. The formal record picks up again at the point of distribution, or sale. Captives of high social status, women from noble or priestly families, daughters of foreign kings or administrators, were sometimes separated for use in the Roman triumph ceremony itself. The triumph was Rome's most elaborate public ritual of victory, a procession through the city culminating at the Capitoline Hill. Captives walked in these processions in visible chains. They were the proof of Roman power, displayed to the population of Rome as living evidence of the city's supremacy. After the triumph, the fate of high-status captives varied. Some were executed publicly, like Jugurtha, or Vercingetorix, who was strangled in the Tullianum prison after Caesar's triumph. Women of comparable status were more often sold into domestic slavery within Roman aristocratic households, where their former rank became an irony embedded in their new condition. For the vast majority of captured women, the process was less theatrical and more transactional. The slave markets of the Roman world were sophisticated commercial operations. Delos, in the Aegean, functioned as one of the largest slave trading hubs in the ancient Mediterranean world, and ancient sources suggest its capacity for processing large numbers of enslaved people was extraordinary by the standards of the era. When a major city fell, the volume of newly enslaved people entering the market could be staggering. Plutarch's account of the aftermath of the sack of Epirus in 167 BCE, attributed to the general Aemilius Paulus, describes the simultaneous capture of approximately 150,000 people from some 70 Epirote towns in a single coordinated military operation. The numbers in ancient sources require careful scrutiny, and historians debate their precision. But even adjusted for ancient rhetorical inflation, the scale indicates an operation of enormous logistical complexity, one that required infrastructure, record-keeping, and commercial networks already in place. The sale process involved physical examination. This was documented in Roman commercial and legal texts as standard practice for slave transactions, intended to disclose physical condition and potential defects that might affect price or utility. For women, this examination was not limited to assessments of health or labor capacity. The records, read carefully, indicate that the criteria applied to women in slave markets included evaluations that have no counterpart in the assessment of male agricultural or craft slaves. Roman jurists wrote about these categories without apparent discomfort. They were describing commercial practice. The discomfort, if it was felt at all, did not reach the written record. A woman who passed through the slave market and entered a Roman household occupied a legal position defined entirely by her owner. Roman law granted the dominus, the master, comprehensive authority over enslaved persons in his household. This authority was not merely economic. It extended to decisions about the enslaved person's body, labor, reproduction, and relationships. An enslaved woman could form no legally recognized union. Children she bore were born into slavery, regardless of the identity of the father. The father could be the master himself. Roman law accommodated this without requiring acknowledgement, compensation, or any change in the legal status of either the mother or the child. Some Roman moralists wrote about the mistreatment of enslaved women. Seneca, in the 1st century CE, used language that sounds, from a modern perspective, almost like condemnation. But reading his texts carefully reveals something more instructive. Seneca's argument was not that enslaved women had rights that were being violated. His argument was that excessive cruelty was beneath the dignity of the Roman master. The concern was with Roman character, not with the suffering of the enslaved. The institution itself was never in question in his writing, or in any mainstream Roman philosophical tradition. Stoic, Epicurean, and Aristotelian frameworks all found accommodation with slavery. The women captured in Rome's wars had no philosophical tradition within Roman culture that named their condition as a wrong requiring correction. Stop here for a moment. What has been described so far, the categorization, the sale, the legal frameworks, the philosophical silence, none of it was considered aberrant within Roman society. There was no underground faction arguing that the capture and enslavement of women after military victory was a crime. There were no protests at the slave markets of Delos. When Roman citizens watched the triumph procession and saw captive women walking in chains behind the victorious general's chariot, they were not watching something that unsettled the social consensus. They were watching something that confirmed it. The system was not a deviation from Roman order. The system was Roman order expressing itself with complete consistency. This is the moment in the story where the architecture of the thing becomes visible. Not the individual acts, those varied enormously in their specific brutality or relative tolerance, but the structure that made those acts invisible as moral questions. Rome did not need to suppress outrage about the treatment of captured women because outrage, as a systemic response, had no ideological ground to stand on. The law said they were property. The philosophers said the arrangement was natural. The ritual of the triumph said it was glorious. The slave market said it was profitable. Every institution pointed in the same direction, and the direction was, this is normal. That is the architecture of an atrocity that does not know it is one. There were women who resisted. The record of their resistance is fragmentary, distorted by the fact that it was written almost entirely by people who had no interest in preserving it accurately. But traces remain. Appian, writing in the 2nd century CE about the fall of Carthage in 146 BCE, describes women fighting from rooftops and from within buildings during the final days of the siege. Not soldiers, not trained fighters, but women who understood precisely what capture meant and chose the roof over the column. Josephus, writing about the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, describes the final hours inside the city with a specificity that later manuscript editors found uncomfortable enough to soften. What he records, in language that is clinical precisely because the event it describes is not, are women who, in the last hours before the gates gave way, made choices about themselves and their children that Roman writers categorized as madness or despair, but which read, in the unedited passages, as something more deliberate, a refusal to be processed. Josephus was not sympathetic to these women in any modern sense. He was a Roman collaborator writing for a Roman audience. And yet, the acts he recorded were specific enough and disturbing enough that the instinct of later editors was to remove them. The fact that they were removed is itself a kind of evidence. You do not erase what does not matter. Individual acts of resistance within slavery are harder to document. Roman legal texts contain provisions about enslaved people who ran away, who harmed their masters, who refused to work. The texts discuss remedies and punishments without pausing to consider what conditions produced the behavior they were legislating against. An enslaved woman who was punished for resistance appears in the record only as a legal problem to be resolved. Her perspective, her name, her history before capture, these are not preserved. The legal system was not designed to preserve them. It was designed to process her efficiently back into the category of manageable property. What did survive, in some cases, was the evidence of attempts at communication across the distance that slavery imposed. Graffiti found in Pompeii and at other sites in the Roman world includes writing in multiple languages, Latin mixed with Greek, Oscan, and other languages of the Mediterranean, that scholars interpret as indicating the presence of people who carried multiple linguistic identities into Roman urban spaces. Some of the graffiti is impossible to date precisely, impossible to attribute with certainty to enslaved or free individuals. But the mixture of languages on walls that Rome built tells a partial story of people who kept something of an earlier identity alive in the only medium available to them. The women taken after conquest did not disappear entirely from the Roman imagination. They were transformed by it. Roman poetry, particularly the elegiac tradition, contains a recurring figure, the captive woman, capta, who becomes the object of Roman male desire. Ovid wrote about capta explicitly, deploying the language of military conquest as metaphor for erotic pursuit. The metaphor worked, was legible, was literary, because the reality it drew on was familiar. Roman readers understood the capta as a real category of person. Ovid borrowed the emotional weight of that reality and applied it to poetry about seduction. The effect, perhaps unintentional, was to aestheticize a system of capture and possession that operated in the actual world with none of the playful ambiguity of elegy. Roman visual culture did the same thing. Marble reliefs on triumphal monuments depicted captured women in poses that Roman sculptors clearly intended as beautiful. The women are shown in attitudes of grief, submission, or resignation that the artistic tradition rendered with technical virtuosity and evident aesthetic investment. The Arch of Titus in Rome, completed in 81 CE after the sack of Jerusalem, carries relief panels depicting the spoils of the temple being carried in triumph. Later Roman triumphal imagery included female personifications of conquered peoples, seated, bound, or mourning, that served as decorative elements on public buildings and coins. These images were not hidden. They were displayed on the most public monuments in the most important city in the Western world. They were meant to be seen. The message encoded in them, that conquered women were part of Rome's trophy collection, was not subtext. It was the text. There is something deeply instructive about the aestheticization of this system. It suggests that Roman culture did not simply tolerate the capture and enslavement of women as a necessary evil of military operations. It found the image of the conquered woman beautiful. It made art of her loss. That is a more advanced form of erasure than simple neglect. It replaces the person with a symbol and then expresses admiration for the symbol, and in doing so, forecloses the possibility of recognizing the person at all. The formal end of a captive woman's previous identity was, in many cases, bureaucratic. When enslaved people were sold in Roman markets, they were given new names. This was standard practice, documented in slave sale contracts that have survived in papyrus form from Roman Egypt and in other parts of the empire. The new name was often a simple Latin or Greek name, sometimes derived from the seller's name, sometimes arbitrary. The old name, the name given at birth, in a language Rome may not have spoken, within a family that no longer legally existed, was not recorded. The sale contract noted physical characteristics for identification purposes: the price paid, the seller's name, the buyer's name, sometimes a guarantee of health and temperament. The person's former identity appears nowhere in the document. It was not legally relevant. The document was not lying. It was simply recording what Roman law considered worth recording. And Roman law had decided that a captured woman's past was not among those things. A small number of enslaved women managed, over years, to accumulate peculium, informal savings a master might permit but never legally relinquish. Some were eventually manumitted, freed through formal procedure, entering Roman society as libertae, with subordinate but recognized legal standing. A freed woman could hold property, form legal unions, transmit status to her children. It was, in Roman terms, a kind of recovery. But manumission was entirely at the master's discretion. The path to it ran through years or decades of a condition the law described in terms of property, and that daily life enforced with the full weight of Roman social authority. The few who emerged had passed through something the record does not fully describe, and arrived somewhere that was not where they had started, and were never the same as what they had been before the gates fell. And here is the thing the written record almost never addresses. What became of the memory of all this? Not in the women who lived it, but in the civilization that administered it. The record of what Rome did after military victory was, in some ways, well preserved, because Rome was a literate, administrative civilization that generated enormous quantities of written material. But the record of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of Roman victory was systematically not preserved, because the people on that receiving end had no access to the institutions through which Roman memory was made and kept. Livy wrote Rome's history. Tacitus wrote Rome's history. Suetonius, Plutarch writing about Roman subjects, Appian, Cassius Dio. These men wrote Rome's history from within Roman cultural assumptions, for Roman audiences, in the service of Roman self-understanding. When they described the sack of a city, they described it from outside the city. The women inside the city appear in their accounts as quantities, as dramatic color, as evidence of the scale of Roman achievement. Their interior experience, what it was to stand in that column, holding a bronze clasp, watching the world you had known become unrecognizable. That experience was not the subject of Roman historical writing, because Roman historical writing was not interested in it. What survives instead are the gaps, the places where the record is conspicuously thin. The slave sale contracts that record everything except the person's original name. The legal texts that discuss the bodies of enslaved women as objects of contractual guarantee without reference to any subjectivity those bodies might contain. The triumphal reliefs that show faces arranged in sorrow without suggesting that the sorrow referred to anything real. The gaps are not accidental. They are the shape of the erasure, visible in outline even when the content has been removed. Archaeology has, in the last several decades, begun to recover some of what the written record chose not to keep. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from Roman-era burial sites has identified individuals whose childhood nutrition and environmental exposure were inconsistent with the region where they were buried. People who grew up somewhere else and ended up, at death, in a Roman context. Some of these individuals were buried without grave goods, without inscriptions, in locations and postures consistent with low social status. The analysis cannot tell us how they arrived. It can tell us that they arrived from somewhere else, and that they died in a Roman world, and that nothing above the grave marked who they had been before. What the bones cannot say, the ground still holds. Buried without name, without marker, without the objects a Roman citizen would carry into death, these women left an imprint that Roman record-keeping never intended to preserve. And they were not alone. DNA analysis from Roman-era sites in Italy has begun to reveal the genetic diversity of the population that lived in Rome during the imperial period. A diversity far greater than the Roman self-image of a people descended from Romulus and the Latin founders would suggest. Rome absorbed people from across the Mediterranean, from North Africa, from the Near East, from Northern Europe. Some of those people came as merchants, diplomats, or free migrants. Some came as slaves. The genetics cannot, at this stage, distinguish between those categories. What the genetics show is that the population of Rome was a record of the empire's reach, written in the bodies of people who had no say in their presence there. There is a burial site from the Roman period, excavated in the late 20th century at a location that will not be specified here, because the identification of the site is still subject to scholarly dispute, where a group of women were interred without grave markers, in a pattern that the excavating team described in their preliminary report as consistent with low-status or institutionalized burial. Among the skeletal remains, one individual had worn, at some point in her life, a small bronze object around her neck. The object was found near the clavicle. It was a clasp, the kind pressed to fabric at the shoulder. It had no Roman hallmarks. It was not made in any workshop whose style the excavating team could identify with confidence in the existing literature. It came from somewhere else. So did she. The question that the Roman system never asked. The question that the legal texts, the triumphal reliefs, the slave sale contracts, the philosophical traditions, and the historical chronicles never posed was a simple one. It was not a complex philosophical question. It did not require access to traditions that had not yet been developed. It was a question available to any person with the capacity for ordinary human recognition. What is it like to be her? Rome chose, systematically and institutionally, not to ask. The choice was not made once by one person in one moment of moral failure. It was made continuously, across centuries, by lawyers writing property law, by generals distributing Praeda, by sculptors arranging marble faces in attitudes of decorative grief, by poets borrowing the emotional weight of captivity for erotic metaphor, by historians describing the sack of cities from the outside. Each of those choices was small. Each of them was, within its own institutional context, unremarkable. Together, they constituted a civilization that processed the capture and enslavement of women on an industrial scale, and recorded the experience with the equanimity of someone recording a favorable exchange rate. That equanimity was not indifference in the modern sense. It was something more structured than indifference. It was a trained incapacity, the product of institutions, laws, rituals, and aesthetic traditions all pointing in the same direction, all reinforcing the same conclusion: that certain people were not the kind of people whose experience required acknowledgement. Once a civilization agrees on that conclusion, it does not need to be brutal to enact it. It simply needs to be consistent. The woman with the bronze clasp, if she was real, and the archaeology suggests she may have been, left no written record. She left no name in any document that has survived. She left no account of where she came from or how she arrived where she was buried. What she left was the clasp itself, worn against her skin, kept through whatever process brought her to that grave. It is not certain that she kept it deliberately. It is not certain that she understood it as an act of preservation, but it survived. And the fact that it survived, that it was there, against her clavicle, in a burial that Rome did not bother to mark, suggests something that the written record could not accommodate: that she had a before, that there was a life, a household, a shoulder where the clasp had once fastened a cloak before any of this began. Rome was very good at erasing befores. It replaced them with categories: capta, praeda, serva, liberta. Each category was a kind of administration. Each administration was a kind of forgetting. The forgetting was so thorough, so institutionally reinforced, so aesthetically endorsed, that it lasted. The triumphal arches are still standing. The legal texts are still read in law schools. The marble faces arranged in decorative grief are still displayed in museums under lighting designed to show their technical excellence. The clasp is in a storage drawer somewhere. It has a catalog number. It does not have her name. The question worth sitting with, the one that does not resolve itself cleanly, is not whether Rome was uniquely monstrous. It was not. Systems that transform people into categories and then mistake the category for the person have appeared in many places and many times. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable than a verdict on Rome. It is this: when a civilization builds institutions so comprehensive, so legally precise, so aesthetically refined, so philosophically comfortable, that the question, what is it like to be her, simply never arises, What does that civilization tell us about the conditions under which the same question can fail to arise today?